Hello, everybody. This is Adam Serwer, and you're watching Adamize. I'm here with National Review's Dan Foster. How are you doing, Dan?
I'm good, Adam. How are you?
I'm good. I'm great. I guess we're starting off today. The CPAC, which is the large annual gathering of conservatives sponsored by the American Conservative Union, is coming together very soon, and I'm interested to hear from you. You know, this is the first CPAC since the election, of course, and I'm just sort of interested to hear from you. What you think what you think is important about the gathering coming up, and how it reflects on where conservatism is, just a few months after the election.
Yeah. Well, broadly speaking, there's been a lot of good and I think fruitful discussion on the right and in the center and on the left, for that matter, about where the Republican Party is, where the conservative movement is. That's focused on a couple of key tensions that are going to have to be resolved one way or another. One of them, and Josh Barrow pointed this out, and in a different way, David Brooks pointed it out a couple of weeks ago. There's a big discrepancy between the perception and the success of the Republican Party at the state levels, and of conservative governing principles at the state level and local level, and the perception and effectiveness of the Republican brand, the party, and Republican policy ideas, especially economic agenda, at the national level. And I think this is something that, that the conservative movement, the Republican Party, is going to have to sort out. Why are they so much?
Can you flesh that out a little bit? I mean, yeah. I think I know what you're saying, right? You're saying that there are a lot of very popular conservative governors.
Yeah.
But the Republicans in Congress are pretty much hated. They're not very well liked, particularly compared to, say, guys like Cash or Scott Walker or Chris Christie.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and the point that Barrow makes is that you're right. There are first of all, there are 30 Republican. I always get that number confused. I think there are 30 Republican governors and some slightly smaller number of states with Republican-controlled legislatures. But the Republican Party is much more successful, both in the executive and legislative branches at the state level, than it is at the national level. As you know, the reason why the Republicans control the House is census-driven gerrymandering. Otherwise, it would have been an absolute and total loss in 2012. And the question is, why is that true? And Barrow makes the case that Republicans at the state level are just offering are more motivated by and incentivized to offer governing programs that work and serve the interests of their constituents. And so in the case of a guy like Christie, for instance, and you could say this about all of the Republican governors who took the Medicaid expansion, I think there's 9 of them now, they're
including, I think, Rick Scott, which was a huge surprise.
Rick Scott was a big deal, yeah, especially because he kind of made his bones fighting Obamacare, especially.
Right.
His point was that, Barrow's point is that those guys are, motivated by serving the interests of their constituents, and at the state level, that he also makes a good point, I think, about how at the state level, one of the central and I think somewhat lazy metaphors of the Republican Party is that government should be run more like business. And Barrow says, at the state level, that actually makes a bit of sense, whereas at the national level, it doesn't. I think he's basically right about that. I'd come at it from a different angle, and I've been kind of tinkering around with this, writing a piece on this, so I guess Blogging Heads will get a preview of it. But I just don't think there's the demand at the national level. There's no market for Republicans to offer policy solutions. That's not what Republicans are for at the national level. And to kind of
now, why do you think that is? Well, I think that's a really interesting statement, but I'm wondering why you think that's the case.
Well, because I think like I said, I think Barrow's basically right, but I'd come at it from a different angle. And a couple of weeks ago, I wrote a piece against rebranding of the Republican Party, or rather, it was less normative than it was just this is why I don't think a major rebranding will happen. Although there was some recommendation in there too. But one of the planks is what I call the granularity of the House of Representatives, and we tend to forget that no matter what David Brooks or Matt Lewis or Rich Lowry at National Review has to say about what the party should do, or Newt Gingrich or whoever, it's still the case that the atomic unit of Washington, D.C. is basically the safe seat representative in the House. And so when you're talking about changing the culture of the Republican Party or changing the emphasis, you're talking about 200 plus members who are, wherever they come from, their interests are provincial, their incentives are provincial, they're motivated by their own reelection, they're usually in safe seats because of, either gerrymandering or just the nature of the district that they represent. And so when you're talking about moderating the message of the Republican Party or making key shifts on stuff, you have to forget that you have to remember that what that means is changing 200 people's minds in the House of Representatives who really don't have any incentive to rethink their policy. And the way this connects to the statement I just made is that whereas conservatives and Republicans are elected to to mayorships and to town councilman spots and to state legislative spots to administer government services that are considered legitimate even by conservatives and Republicans in most cases, there is a market for policy entrepreneurship, smarts, problem solving, compromise to a much greater extent than there is at the National Republican Party. And what I mean by that is most conservatives are federalists, right? And most conservatives think that the breadth of the federal government's powers should be restricted. I always describe myself as deep but not broad. I think the government should be a leviathan. The federal government should be a leviathan in the few key areas of its proper scope, but that scope should be very, very narrow. Now, obviously, states have much broader powers and administer social services and maintain infrastructure and all this other stuff that Republicans and conservatives ostensibly are fine with. So while there's an incentive to elect guys who are going to be great administrators of those social services, who are going to be entrepreneurial and maybe figuring out better, more free market ways of doing that stuff, at the national level, the real motivation is just to elect Republicans who say no. And I think that's a mixed bag because I'm a federalist too, and I think the federal government's too powerful. But
I would put that a different way. I don't think it's entirely wrong, but I think what there's a market for in these, particularly in House districts, there's a market for purity. Yeah, you can get reelected, whereas a governor or a mayor has to really have some things that they can say that they've done. Congressmen don't actually have to do anything. I mean, I feel like what's, and particularly now, the conservative movement has been much more successful in enforcing ideological discipline through primaries than liberals have been, and I think as a result, you have these, you have competition for, and as a result of also redistricting, you have a competition for increasingly homogenous districts where what really matters, what there's really a market for, is a kind of no compromising ideological purity that when you're the administrator of a state or city government, isn't really in your interest.
I think that's right, but I would ask you: Do you think that it's true that you can be a Democrat in the House and get reelected and by doing nothing, by proposing no new legislation, by not reaching out?
Not by doing nothing. I wouldn't say doing nothing. You can get elected without getting anything done. Does that make any sense?
Oh yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, it's the easiest thing in the world to walk down to the pit of the House of Representatives and sign your name as a co-sponsor.
Make a speech, send out a press release, denounce of this, condemn of that, praise of this, celebrate. It's just much easier. But I think that in general, and I think this is reflected in the ideological compositions of the parties themselves, the conservative movement has been much more effective in being able to scare the shit out of representatives in the House. With possible primary challenges. I think that's true of the Senate too, but not quite as true. I mean, you still have got, it's just not the same issue in the Senate. I think representing whole states, but
right. And the Senate as an institution tends to capture senators better, I think, than the House institution does. The House is still an anonymous mob, essentially, and the Senate is
Right.
much more. But I think there's something to what you say. But to me, it's a question of which is pulling the causal string. It's
Right.
kind of chicken and egg. And I would say that again, the key is that the question I always ask when I'm looking at American politics is where are the asymmetries? Because 80% of lazy political punditry is your side does it too, right? So so it's interesting, and not just for blame game stuff, but to understand the actual dynamics of how party politics and ideology works in the context of American politics. I think it's interesting to look at asymmetries between the way the left does it, the way the right does it, between the way the Democrats do it, the Republicans do it, House, Senate, whatever it is. And one place I really do think there's an asymmetry, and again, this is me just kind of pushing my original point, is that you can get elected as a Republican on an entirely negative platform. And I don't mean negative as in mean. I mean negative as in what can you stop from happening in Washington? And I think that's and that might sound obvious, but again, I'm trying to get at the reason why the National Republican Party is different than the state-based one. Because, like I said, you said that the conservative movement is more successful at reining in maybe potential rhino-y types or compromisers through primaries and just general, badgering in the conservative press and all that stuff. I think there's a certain truth to that, but that almost might give too much independent agency to this nebulous concept of the conservative movement. I'm not trying to suggest it doesn't exist, but, like I said, it's tough to tease out who's really, whether the tail's wagging the dog or the dog's wagging the tail. I just think that organically, Republican voters who might have one set of interests in seeing their state government administered in a certain way want to send people to Washington who are going to keep Washington out of their state, who are going to keep Washington out of their school boards, who are going to keep Washington out of their pocketbooks.
But it's more complicated than that, right? Because they also do. I mean, they want Washington out of the way, but they also want Washington to, foot the bill for their nice state services that are being administered by the state, but in practice are like very much financially reliant on the federal government.
I think that's true. I think that's cognitive dissonance, and I think a lot of people don't actually realize that they have both of those priorities and that they're contradictory. There's no law that says voters have to be rational. So I think you're right, but I think something that's going on closer to the surface, closer to the level of conscious decision making and voter behavior for people who vote on the right, is that I don't need Paul Ryan as my. Paul Ryan's an interesting case, right? Ross Douthat was wondering this aloud on Twitter the other day, and I think it's a great question. I think that something like the story I've been telling for the last 10 minutes is the answer to it. But Ross wonders why there aren't more Republican policy entrepreneurs, considering the few that there are in the House and the Senate are really famous, right? And Paul Ryan's a good example of that. He's a guy who has a health care plan. And Ross has been at the forefront for the last 4 years of saying, hey, look, the reason why we're staring, he wrote this 4 years ago, the reason why we're staring Obamacare down the barrel is because Republicans have totally abdicated this issue for the last 10 years, since, ever since they beat the Hillary Clinton plan. And he's absolutely right. So this is why I say it's a mixed bag, because even though I count myself as one of these Federalists who really is just content to send obstructionists to Washington. I know that really frustrates a lot of people in the center and left, but I'm very much content on that generally. The problem is that we're going to get, the middle third of this country wants the government to do certain things, and we're going to get big old bills that do those things. That's going to happen. I'm always reminded, I use this anecdote all the time, but I just think it was a really good example for me as a young reporter asking a question that I felt really self-righteous about asking and then kind of getting smacked down in a polite way. I was talking to Karl Rove a couple years ago, and I said, why the hell did you guys do Medicare Part D? It's this huge cudgel that we're getting beat over the head with now. Republicans like big government too. They passed this huge deficit-funded entitlement. They got nothing to say on Obamacare. And what Rove said to me was, you got to remember the choice wasn't between pass Medicare Part D and do nothing. It was between pass the Republican market-driven Medicare Part D, yes, it was deficit financed, or pass Ted Kennedy's bill, right? So it was going to happen, and I think that's something that Republicans don't think enough about. I should say conservatives. Republicans think enough about it, but conservatives don't think enough about, and they are unwilling to reckon with. The American people wanted health care reform. That was going to happen. There was a once-in-a-generation opportunity for it to happen. And the question is, do you have Republicans in Washington who are in elected office who are going to be proactive on offering, what we think are, friendlier, more market-driven alternatives or smaller footprint alternatives? And for instance, we got this guy who's great. He's a day job and makes a lot more money doing it than he does working for us. But we have this guy Ovik Roy who writes wonderfully about healthcare policy. He's a conservative, down the line conservative, but a brilliant guy and a great, like I said, analyst of the healthcare sector in his day job, and then he blogs about it for us at night. And he and Doug Holtz-Eakin have this great, from what I've seen of it, reading their stuff on it, reform.
Yeah, I read that piece.
Yeah, it would be a reform of, and the main reason that they got any traction on it, they basically offered this version of the Switzerland model for providing universal coverage that's a little more market-driven, but still very, very heavily regulated. And they offered it as a compromise, and they referred to it as a reform of the Affordable Care Act. And the only reason they got any traction was because people like Matt Iglesias and Ezra Klein said, this is a surrender. Here are two conservative policy wonks tacitly admitting that Obamacare is here to stay. So that's why it got a little oxygen, but I just thought to myself, man, this is so unfortunate. Why aren't there more elected Republicans and conservative thinkers who care about this stuff? And why isn't there more oxygen, for thinking about better ways to do things? But again, it's just because I don't think there's a market for sending Republicans to Washington to do things. There's a market for sending Republicans to Washington to stop things from happening. But again, and I'm repeating myself now, but that's
really the problem, right? I mean, like I know you're saying that, but it's like, this tension that you're talking about, I think, is reflected. So one of the things that you did a couple years ago was you did this like deeply reported piece on Chris Christie's battle with the teachers' unions in New Jersey, and this was when everybody was like, "I want Christie to run for president."
Yeah.
Not Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney's lame, and like now Chris Christie is like just like a total traitor. In some sort of conservative circles, he's like treated like a complete Judas. And my favorite recent moment that reflected this was when there was this report that Christie said something like, I probably agree with Andrew Cuomo on like 90% of issues.
Yeah.
And I read that and I shrugged. And almost every person on the left, every Democrat that I met who read that shrugged, because they were like, well, yeah, you know what I mean? Like the two things that they had both been known for in the past couple of years had been taking on the unions and the pensions.
Yeah.
And successfully. I remember reading pieces in National Review at the time, praising Andrew Cuomo, but after the election, where Christie was seen as having, for some people was seen as having delivered the election to Obama, it was like, see, this is proof that Christie is like a total, he's a total traitor. And I was like, well, actually, it's more proof that Cuomo is a pretty conservative Democrat,
right,
on fiscal issues. But it was really interesting to me that whereas before it had been totally cool to point out that Christie and Cuomo had been pursuing similar agendas, and in fact, even just to point out that Democrats were being hypocritical because Cuomo wasn't facing as much opposition or whatever, this was like a total shock. But I mean, I remember when Hurricane Sandy happened, and Obama sort of hugged Christie, and Christie was fine with that, and he was like, well, his response was I think literally something like, well, I've got a state to run. I'm not worried about your ideological purity, and that struck me. I mean, and this wasn't the first time he did this. I think the time before that I really remember was when he appointed a Muslim judge in New Jersey, and the sort of anti-Sharia wing of the conservative movement freaked out, and he was just he basically told them to perform an anatomical impossibility.
Yeah.
But but I mean,
he also
appointed.
I should point out he also appointed the first gay black Republican judge in the state of New Jersey.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, this is I think he's like a pretty good example of what you're talking about, where like you have this guy who's immensely popular, who's actually really conservative, who now, for some reason, whose name is now Mud, not because of an ideological alignment with Barack Obama, but actually just because of the fact that they were friendly at sort of like a crucial political moment. I mean, that's very strange, and I think that's part of what I'm saying when I'm talking about this problem of ideological purity with the National Republican Party, is that they can't. If they can't countenance a guy like Christie, who's really conservative and who's doing fiscally everything they want, you want a Republican governor of a blue state like New Jersey to do, because he's nice to Obama. I mean, that's a pretty serious problem.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. I'll say a couple general things about conservatives and their relationship to figures like Christie, and then we can talk a little bit more about the specifics of the Christie case. Mm-hmm. But the part of it, I think is that, and this is a much longer conversation and something I'd really like to think about and sink my teeth into, but part of what you see happening, I think, with conservatism in America is that it's something of a victim of its own success in the past. And my colleague Ramesh Ponnuru pointed this out in the context of Reagan worship. He wrote a great piece for the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about, Reagan was a great guy, but it's easy for us to forget that Reagan was responding to the challenges of the 1970s. And
yeah, I remember that piece. And what struck me about it was that he quoted a Reagan quote that I've heard used so many times, and he's like, but everybody forgets the first part. It was something like, government is not the problem, government is not the solution, government is the problem. But right. He's like, everybody always cuts off in our present crisis.
Exactly.
Which is just like, that was just, I thought that was really well done.
Yeah. And it's not to denigrate Reagan or whatever, who.
No, I don't think that's a denigration at all, but I do think it's like, there's a kind of, the Reagan who, allowed, who passed, for example, the 1986 Simpson-Mazzoli Act, would not be, very welcome in the Republican Party today. I mean, I think he's just saying, there you have to. Well, go ahead. I'll let you say.
I was just going to say, without getting into a whole discursus on what movement conservatism is, because there's 100 books written on the topic that I encourage all of our viewers to read, but the idea, and Bill Buckley was one of the inventors of it, the founder of my magazine, and the idea that there was a conservative movement. Conservatism was kind of a diffuse temperament before Buckley and National Review came around, and Barry Goldwater was the first real elected official, to energize conservatives around a single cause, and then of course Reagan is canonically thought of as the ultimate, the peak success of the conservative movement. Even by the time you get Newt Gingrich in 1994, you're already, Contract with America stuff, you're already starting to drift away from the particular, a group of forces that led to, Reagan and Goldwater and those guys. So, but my point is that, for a long time it was just a weird and bizarre thing to speak of a conservative movement, almost as if the two words were contradictory, because you had conservatives in both parties for most of the 20th century, right? And you had progressives in both parties, as you know, for most of the 20th century. And I think conservatives got and they don't even realize it, but they get a little too enamored with the model, with the kind of Reagan model that you can kind of gather up all these people with the same disposition, and almost like like the progressive movement, or like other very, very well organized forces on the left, the temperance movement, whatever. That somehow this is a sustainable way of consistently electing relevant, forward-looking, adaptive to our current crisis, conservative government. And I think that's a problem. And I think so. The reason I bring this up, like I said, without getting into a whole aside on it, is because I think the purity stuff and rejecting a guy like Christie is a symptom of thinking that this really tightly coordinated and very ideologically pure movement, the movement that produced Barry Goldwater and then elected Ronald Reagan twice, was, there were polite disagreements in the pages of National Review, but it was a very coherent, it was a big tent because they had a lot of Democrats vote for Reagan, but it was ideologically what you recognize now as three-legged stool conservatism, right? I mean, there wasn't a lot of heresy. It was pretty recognizable in its current form. So, but I think that and that's kind of what Ramesh is getting at, is that was a very popular. Reagan kicked ass in 2 straight elections, and then Bush, he was still popular enough that H.W. Bush kind of rode his coattails in '88. That was still a very timely response, and a very popular timely response to a particular set of problems. And the problem is, that the national conservative movement thinks that you don't have to adapt your policy mix to the changing times, and so and also you don't have to try and make the tent a little bit bigger. I mean, the reason you were able to you look at it this way, reverse engineer it. You had deeply blue states vote for Ronald Reagan, especially in 1984. You had a lot of Democrats vote for Ronald Reagan. Maybe it was just that, like in the situation with Cuomo and Christie now, and you saw a number of governors across the states in 2009, 2010, following the same playbook of dealing with out-of-control pension plans, out-of-control spending on labor and health benefits for the public sector, and you saw Republicans and Democrats take very, very similar approaches, exactly what you talked about, Cuomo and Christie. There wasn't much daylight between them on the way that they dealt with the public sector. Maybe that's just because there's a widespread consensus that that's what needed to be done. I mean, there's this, I think, emphasis on the right with evangelizing the core set of conservative principles, and thinking that you can win converts through purity and evangelism. And I think we do.
I think
do
that's.
Much better.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, and I just think we do much better to think of, to lead with what are the times called for, and then you end up with 60-70% majorities. Like I said, the Cuomo Christie example is a perfect one, because however you feel about the way that they, or even Scott Walker, dealt with public sector.
Well, it's very different, right? I mean, the Scott Walker example is something. I think part of the reason why Cuomo and I mean, Cuomo did something very different. I mean, he beat the unions, but he didn't try to destroy the unions.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, the very, like, I remember conservatives running at the time, why isn't Cuomo getting as much shit? And it's like, because Cuomo is shafting the unions, but he's not trying to destroy them as an entity. And
Christie too, right? I remember, right. Just briefly, Christie said to us when he came in the last time he was at NR, which was a couple of years ago, he said, I'm pro union. I have no problem with collective bargaining. I just think it should be an adversarial process, and that's the whole point. He just, he says, I have no problem with collective bargaining because I know I'm the guy on the other side of the table. Christie's a cocky guy, but he had a point. And the refreshing thing to see from Cuomo was that for the most part it was an adversarial process. It wasn't. You don't have this. The criticism of of good governance types on the right, from AEI to Cato to Reason, is that when you have collective bargaining in the public sector, you usually have the same. The bankrollers of the guys. Who are elected to determine their compensation, sitting at the other side of the table. That's the big complaint on the right. So in both the Christie and the Cuomo cases, you're right. They embrace the collective bargaining process. They just won.
Right.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, for me, sort of proves that you don't actually. I mean, like, there's a big ideological argument that you have to destroy the public sector unions, but in fact, I think I think that proves that you actually don't have to do that. But I want to get back to something that you were saying about Reagan, which is this sort of like weird. It's weird that the cult of Reagan remembers Reagan as being so ideologically pure, precisely because he wasn't. Maybe he was. Maybe he was in the same sense that, like, I think Barack Obama is, a pretty liberal guy,
Mm-hmm.
but like constrained by objective factors, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like by who controls how much of Congress, what public opinion is. Like maybe Reagan was the most conservative person ever, but in fact he was actually willing to do some things that would be today considered not very conservative at all.
Yeah,
And I think that's it's like genuinely strange given how much time like it's just like it's like a perennial like constant thing. Whenever conservatives freak out about something that liberals are doing, liberals will just be like, oh well, guess what Reagan did. Well, it's like a reverse God when it's like who else wanted to give immigrants undocumented immigrant citizenship. Like it's just like it's a weird. It's like despite that sort of constant trolling, there is still this like weird memory of Reagan as like someone who never ever compromised or who never did anything that might be considered divergent from like core conservative principles.
Yeah, and this is kind of what I was talking about in the idea that there was going to be healthcare reform, and it was and conservatives should have gotten on board and tried to make sure that the best, friendliest version of it passed. Guys who actually get elected to the presidency, and who find themselves in positions of power realize that governing requires compromise. So you did see Reagan compromise on a lot of stuff, but the thing that Reagan did, and that I think Obama does, especially post-reelect with the first State of the Union and the second inaugural speech, is he's telegraphing to the I won't say to the far left, but to liberals that I'm one of you, and then he goes and even to a much greater extent than he did in the first term, and then he goes and is constrained and advocates a center-left mix of policies rather than a left-left mix of policies because of all the reasons that you mentioned. But Reagan was such a brilliant communicator that I think a good part of his value was not actually a big part of his value was not actually how he governed, but how he talked about how he governed. And like I said, his evangelism for kind of old school Milton Friedman, free market conservatism. Was so effective. I mean, it's what armed a couple of generations of conservative thinkers and pundits and things like that. So I think to the extent that he compromised as a president, he was such an effective communicator of conservative principles that he kind of fortified the movement for 30 years, and you're still seeing his influence now. But it's still. My problem with and then this is the other thing I was going to say, to close off a couple of these branches. My problem with some of this, I think, is a little bit manufactured, this conservative ideological purity thing, for the following reason. There's too much conflation on both left and right, and we're guilty of it too on the right, between individual vehicles of conservatism and the right, broadly speaking, especially the elected right, elected conservatives and Republicans. And so you're seeing CPAC stand in for, as a kind of synecdoche, to use a $5 word, for the entire conservative movement, and not just for the entire conservative movement, but for the elected Republican class. And so CPAC, which is, I'm not saying it's not an important thing. It's a big conference. A lot of the heavy hitters are there every year. And it's especially for conservative advocacy and activism, it's a huge deal. But you're seeing CPAC exclude again GOProud, the gay conservative group, and the Log Cabin Republicans, the old school centrist gay group. Again, for the second year in a row, they're being excluded from CPAC, and also Christie wasn't invited, and we reported it was because some of their organizers think that Christie's not a real conservative, that he's a rhino, and they had some problems with his stance on gun control and stuff. And, I think that's overblown a little. I mean, I think that, Christie ran as a Republican and won as a Republican, and CPAC is CPAC, and they certainly speak for a segment of conservatives in America, but they don't speak for all of them. I mean, I wrote a piece last week urging CPAC to include GOProud, and I gave 5 reasons why I thought it made sense, and I was very, very pleasantly surprised by the response I got from readers on the right. And basically, and I've said this before, but I'll say it again. There's basically, if you're under 40 and you're a conservative, you range from being, I got to be careful. I don't want to make too broad of a statement, but you range from being basically benignly indifferent to what you might call the gay question to just friendly and welcome everybody into the fold. And it's very much a generational thing, and the polling data backs this up. But I was still very pleasantly surprised. The people who I got praising me for the GOProud column were active duty military. They were young, like college conservatives, like rah-rah guys, Jindal Rubio 2016 guys. And, so you're starting to see a shift even among the set that's likely to think that CPAC's a really important deal. So I think that some of this is a little bit overblown because even though, they didn't invite Christie to CPAC, there are plenty of guys and girls who read National Review and who watch Fox News casually and who voted for Mitt Romney who are Christie fans and who would support Christie in 2016. So some of it's a little. I mean, there's something there. I'm not saying there isn't, but I think it's painted a little overly broad. But it's certainly to get back to the Christie issue. I mean, I joked the other day that maybe I was too ambitious trying to urge CPAC to invite gay conservatives into the fold. Maybe just start with the Republican blue state governor with a 74% approval rating. It's kind of ridiculous that you would shoot yourself in the foot so much and not get the most wildly popular blue state Republican governor in the country and invite him to come speak at your conference. I am mystified by it. At a certain point, you just have to look at and let's quote Reagan. He said, don't make an 80% friend a 20% enemy. Essentially,
So I have my own theory about this, and it's pretty much this, which is that to the extent that you really care about gay rights, you're probably already on the left and not going to vote for a Republican.
Yeah.
And I think there's sort of a strategic belief. It's one that I think is going to have to make an ultimate retreat. But I do think there's sort of a strategic calculation that until we really get to the point where gay rights are a really non-controversial subject, where where it's sort of homophobia is as toxic as say overt racism, that there's this huge population of people in the United States who are really hostile to gay rights and don't like the idea of same-sex marriage, and the Republican Party doesn't want to throw away those votes. That's my
Absolutely.
I think there's I think there's just those people still exist, and as much as and there's a whole the conservatives who are very urban and live in cosmopolitan settings and write for magazines, they might be a lot more willing to be look, I know gay people, I don't think this is as important as say making sure we don't end up with a single player healthcare plan, so who cares? But there are millions of people, maybe hundreds of millions, or not
tens of millions,
probably not hundreds of millions at this point, but tens of millions of people who actually feel very strongly about this and are hostile to it. And the Republican Party doesn't want to throw them away.
I think that's absolutely right. And the only difference between you and me on this is that if you read the column and I've written stuff about this in the past, I support civil unions, legally, equal civil unions for gays. As a matter of fact, I'm one of those cop-out small L libertarians, and I just don't think, I think churches should be able to marry whoever they want, and then there should be civil certificates for everybody else. That's the way I advocate doing it. But I'm also not in a hurry about it. And I think the last time you and I talked about this issue, I was pointing out, and that's what I like about GOProud too. They're not in any big rush about it. And I think, and this is a good transition because I know we wanted to touch on the Voting Rights Act. But, I think that there's a disservice done by people who are, and I don't want to impugn their motives entirely, but there's a desire to morally equate civil rights in the 50s and 60s with the fight over gay marriage now, and I just think that's just a really inapt comparison. And I think the only difference between you and me on your point about not wanting to throw away those voters is that, and this is a very Burkean, old school conservative view that I have, but I just think that's a perfectly legitimate view for people of a certain generation to have. And I think at a certain level, it's almost as if I'm happy to wait until people who are 28 now are in charge of the culture. I'm happy to let those people who are 65 and live in the heartland and who are adamantly opposed to gay marriage, sort of have their beliefs, and enjoy the rest of their time.
Well, I certainly am totally fine with them having their beliefs. My beef, though, is with their beliefs making it so that, two people who have been together for 40 years and just happen to be the same gender, who live in New York, or can't have their marriage recognized by the federal government, because of that couple who doesn't want to accept it. I don't actually, care if that elderly Midwestern couple or whomever doesn't want to accept it. But when I think about something like the fact that someone, for example, just to give a really what I think is the sort of situation that even the staunchest conservative would be uncomfortable with, is that when you think about someone say fighting in Afghanistan whose husband is at home taking care of their kid, and if they die, they won't get the same benefits as they would if they were a heterosexual marriage. That's really terrible to me, and I don't, that's I suspect that this is whatever, if DOMA isn't struck down by the Supreme Court, some case like that will certainly do it. But it's always it's all well and good for people like you and me to say to say we're not in a rush because I'm a heterosexual, I can get married anytime I want, but there are people all over the country who are gay and cannot get married simply because of what amounts to a popularity contest for their rights. And I think so this question of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s and gay rights as civil rights is really fraught. And what I'll tell you is that I've talked to some old civil rights veterans about this. I talked to James Lawson about this for a story a few months ago, and there's a way, there's no question to them that gay rights are civil rights. They're not, to say that is not to say that that the conditions facing gay people in the United States are the same as black people who are facing down American apartheid, in the 50s and 60s. That there's a way in which civil rights has become I think we don't want to conflate civil rights and the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement is a very specific historical thing, and civil rights are something that every American has. Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think the best way to deal with to talk about it is to just say, for my case, and as an advocate for other conservatives, I would just say that we should support 100% equality before the law for same-sex couples. I mean, that's what I support, and I think that's where you'll see Republicans and conservatives move over the next years and decades. But that's different from the culturally fraught question, which I think how to say this? The battle over the word marriage is funny and it's recent. If you think about the coalition of LGBT who fought somebody like Andrew Sullivan in the early 90s on trying to mainstream homosexual marriage, same-sex marriage, who said, we don't want anything to do with that bourgeois institution. Why would we, So it's funny to me, that's a very young phenomenon. So I can say... the idea of same-sex marriage has a conservative inception. It's a conservative idea. Sullivan was, at the time was certainly, now because he's an Obama supporter, he's considered... a lot of people consider him part of the left, even though I wouldn't describe him that way. But I mean, it is sort of a fundamentally conservative idea, particularly particularly when you look back at when it was first introduced. Yeah, no, I think that's right. But this is what I'm talking about. So you can say,
you can say that we're in a rush to make sure that our citizens are equally protected by the laws. And I would agree with it under that aspect, under that characterization. What I'm talking about is that, in culture, and this is something I said in the CPAC piece, in the culture wars, speed kills. And that's as old of a conservative insight as there is. That's Reflections on the Revolution in France. And when you start, and so I am not willing to just admit a priori or just stipulate that less violence would be done to the fabric of American culture by flipping a switch and saying tomorrow every church in the country has to marry same-sex couples.
Well, I hope that's never the case.
Right, I know. I'm just taking the most extreme possible version, right? Or even we could make it a little bit more realistic and just say tomorrow every private business is subject to civil rights era interstate commerce based penalties and liabilities for, say, as happened in New Mexico,
for not recognizing
exactly. If I don't want to do your wedding photographs because I'm a evangelical Christian who opposes same-sex marriage, I'm guilty of a hate crime. If you want to make it more realistic, I'm just absolutely not willing to admit a priori that would be a better outcome to a slow and deliberate 20-year, 30-year process of acclimation in American culture. Like I said, so there's, and here there is a civil rights parallel. I mean, you needed stuff like the Voting Rights Act, and you needed really heavy-handed federal intervention because this was such a unique perversion of the American system and such a unique blot in our history, and that was so foundational to the first 150 years of the country that you needed a really heavy-handed structural rejiggering of the relation between the states and the federal government, blah, 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 to try and begin the process of healing and acclimation between black and white populations.
So here,
but the culture moved much more slowly.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
But the culture moved much more slowly, is my point. And there was still 100 years of violence and horribleness for 1,000 different reasons, despite heavy-handed, federal intervention.
Well, so I think I disagree with you on that, but that could take us down another whole tangent. I mean, I think there was some initial effort, and I think U.S. Grant, and the initial heavy-handed federal efforts were foiled, basically. And so they had to. You require 100 years later. You needed another heavy-handed federal intervention. But I want to move from. I think you said something very interesting earlier, or you were talking about the conservative movement. From Goldwater to Reagan.
Yeah.
And I think the most. I would argue right now that arguably the most important person in the conservative movement right now is an unelected official. It's Chief Justice John Roberts. And I say that because, when you go back to, he is about to, I think, going to the, yesterday I was at the Supreme Court for the arguments over the Voting Rights Act. And I think there's little doubt. I mean, maybe, it could go either way. Obviously, the healthcare ruling was, something of a surprise for everyone, almost everyone. But I think, John Roberts is really poised to pull down the curtain on, the civil rights era legislation with the Voting Rights Act. I mean, for those who aren't aware of what happened, yesterday the Supreme Court was considered the oral arguments over whether or not it was still constitutional for the federal government to subject local election laws in various jurisdictions, mostly in the South, to preclearance, which basically means that these jurisdictions have to ask the Justice Department for permission to change their election laws so that the Justice Department can make sure they're not discriminating against people on the basis of race, that they wouldn't have that they're not purposefully, or that they wouldn't have the effect of discriminating on the basis of race. And I think Roberts comes into the Reagan administration as a young attorney, and he's right in the middle of the battle over the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, and this is 30 years ago. This is 1982. And he loses that battle in Congress. I mean, the Reagan administration loses that battle. I won't go too deep into it. Basically, they wanted a standard for the part of the Voting Rights Act that covers the entire country. They wanted a weaker standard that said, unintentional discrimination would not be covered under the Voting Rights Act. And now he's Chief Justice, and it's sort of, basically he's going to, I think, declare, and I think Jeffrey Toobin had a column on this. He's basically pulling the curtain down on this, on those heavy-handed federal efforts to ensure equality. One of the major ones, he's going to say, this is over. And I think I feel I don't know. I've been ranting for a minute. I feel sort of very angry and strongly about that. But I want to hear what you thought. Particularly listening to some of the things that came out of the hearing. Some of the more famous statements, of course, Scalia calling the Voting Rights Act a racial entitlement. I told you that I cringed at that choice of words. I think a lot of people cringed. I think it wasn't just. I mean, I don't think you were an exception on the conservative side either.
I think that Scalia. I mean, I'm a huge admirer of Scalia's, unapologetically so. But I think that he's a much more careful writer than he. I guess I'm a fan of Scalia on text as opposed to because he pulls a lot of this stuff. He's trying to be funny or provocative or whatever, and he owns some of the more outrageous comments and orals in history. There is a kernel of something in his choice of words that gets at what I think conservatives are uncomfortable with the Voting Rights Act. I just say, as a historian of the Constitution, I'm not a historian of the Constitution. As an amateur historian of the Constitution, somebody who's interested in the Constitution, the way that conservatives and liberals and different judicial philosophies talk about it. What's interesting to me, and you even used the phrase yourself just now, is this still constitutional? Now you could maybe what you meant by that was, do 5 members of the Supreme Court still think it's constitutional? But I think there's something else weird going on here, which is kind of what I was alluding to before, is that the post-slavery, post-emancipation history of race relations and civil rights in this country is so uniquely problematic and rife with challenges that it is as it were, a singular case, a special case when it comes to everything from the scope and role of the federal government to constitutional law. So when I hear, is it still constitutional? What I interpret that to mean is that relationship still so fraught with peril that these extraordinary measures are required? And that's a weird thing to me as somebody who's very much a dead Constitution guy as opposed to a living one. There is this element of historicity, to use another $5 word, in all of this talk, because to me that's the central question. And I'll be honest with you, I haven't formed an opinion on it, and you always got to be careful with stuff like this because it's such a sensitive topic. But you want to be able to say that someday this will be more discriminatory to jurisdictions in the South than it is to African Americans in this country. You want to be able to say that there will be some progress. Maybe it's 100 years from now. Maybe it was 10 years ago. I don't know. Like I said, I don't have a strong opinion. But certainly you want to be able to say in the abstract that there will come a time that the impositions placed on only certain jurisdictions in the southern part of this country do more harm than good. I mean, would you not agree with that?
Well, in the sense that you want there to be a time when it's no longer needed, right?
Yeah.
So this is part of my frustration, right? Is that I think. So, on some, instinctual level, it bothers me that, Goldwater, who ran on opposition, it's like Roberts is a product of Goldwater. Like, you can draw a direct line from Goldwater to Reagan to Roberts. Like, that stream runs in one direction. And Goldwater comes out and he runs on opposition to civil rights legislation. And there's just an instinctive part of me that says John Roberts doesn't get to say when this is over. Because, he is a product of this movement that was on the wrong side of history when this stuff was being done. And that's just, that, apart from the actual, merits arguments about this, that is like a very strong emotional feeling for me. But as far as the merits are concerned, I felt like listening to the arguments, I felt like the conservative justices were very much discussing, how long does it have to be where, how long are we going to keep calling the South racist? When does the South get a break?
Right.
Things have changed so much, and it's true. Things have changed a lot. Things have gotten a lot better. But it's the question. The question when Congress, reauthorized the Voting Rights Act in 2006, they weren't trying to measure anything as abstract as how racist are we. Like I think that's like a tremendously unproductive question in the context of the Voting Rights Act because it's so abstract, it's immeasurable, it's not interesting, it's not helpful to me in that sense, or it's not helpful for understanding the law.
Is not the standard? I'm sorry, don't lose your thought, but is not the standard in Section 5 that jurisdictions with a history of racial discrimination are the ones that are covered? So don't you need to try and define it?
Well, so what you need to define, though, is like there's an empirical question here, which is like how often do these jurisdictions continue? How long has it been since these jurisdictions last did something that would have abridged the right of people to vote on the basis of race? And the county that brought the suit, there is a bailout provision in the Voting Rights Act. So it's in Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, right? So, if we're asking, someday, is there going to be a day where this is no longer needed? And it's like, well, the best part about it is that each individual jurisdiction can prove that it's no longer needed by itself without being chained to other jurisdictions that may be misbehaving. So, it costs about $5,000 to bail out. But you have to have a record of a certain amount of years of not getting in trouble. And what happened with Shelby County was, in 2006, they redistricted the only black city council member in a town in Shelby County out of a job. And that was found, and the way it was done, it was found to be discriminatory. So it was almost like, Justice John Roberts famously said the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race, right?
Yeah.
So I didn't, for me, I'm listening to Shelby County, I'm like, well, why don't, and the rest of the jurisdictions in the South, the easy way never to have to deal with Section 5 again is to not do anything that would not allow you to bail out of Section 5. And, it's completely conceivable that every single state covered by Section 5 could someday bail out and, without, ever, repealing the Voting Rights Act or ever having it overturned, there just simply wouldn't be any more covered jurisdictions. I mean, the entire state of New Hampshire bailed out. For me, what's frustrating is I don't think the court should get to decide that. I think that the law has a way of deciding that inside it. And it's a kind of, Justice Kagan said, you're giving us the power to declare that, to the lawyer arguing the case, she said, it's like you're giving us the power to declare racism is over. And, to quote Kanye, like, no one man should have all that power. Like, that's not something that I think is within the Supreme Court's ability to declare, but I feel like that's almost what they were discussing yesterday.
No one man should have all that Kardashian either, but life isn't fair. No, but the flip side to what Kagan said is that she wants Congress to have the power to declare racism over, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean...
Well, she thinks... Congress created a mechanism for where, the states can decide, the government decides, but the states have agency in making them, in helping them decide.
Yeah, I just, and then the other thing is, you said, I'm speaking from a position of ignorance on this, because you said that, in what the plaintiffs want is for unintentional discrimination, not to count against them. Is that right? That
was Roberts in the 80s. He was, when they were renewing the Voting Rights Act, there's a part of the Voting Rights Act that covers the entire country. It's called Section 2, and there was an argument at the time between the Reagan administration and Congress over whether it would cover, purposeful discrimination or discrimination that would have the effect.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is the jurisprudence, is the judicial standard still disparate impact when it comes to Section 5, or is it something a little narrower?
It was always that way with Section 5, precisely because of the history of the covered jurisdictions. So, and Roberts, even in the 80s, Roberts was not arguing that Section 5, he was fine with the Section 5 jurisdictions. And remember, at this point, the Voting Rights Act, if it had been a person, would not have been old enough to buy a beer. He was perfectly fine with, there being a quote-unquote effects test in Section 5. That is, for the covered jurisdictions in Section 5, if they did something that had the purpose, the effect of abridging the right to vote on the basis of race, that he didn't oppose that. But what he and I think all the other conservative justices are leaning towards is the idea that this is something that this is not the problem it was even 30 years ago, and that it's because of that it's no longer a justified intrusion of the federal government on state sovereignty.
Yeah, well, prima facie, I'm inclined to. I think generally, and you saw this with the firefighter exam a couple years ago. Disparate impact stuff is tricky, and I think you should only, like I said, if you're going to if that's going to be your standard for discrimination, it better be because there is a persistent, deep, and deeply malicious problem with discrimination. And so you have to be very, very, very careful, I think, in saying, you have to get into these abstractions, and you have to get into kind of some even fumbling attempt to talk about how serious a problem it is in America, because disparate impact is such a broad standard and so insensitive to either motives or design or confounding variables or anything else that could be going on in cases like this, that there had better be a really, really serious problem that hurts a lot of people if you're going to use a standard that broad. So that's where I would want to decide, the case on the merits. But again, I don't know. The only hill I'm interested in dying on is that this thing should have an expiration date. Now, it doesn't have to be set, and you say there's a mechanism in the law that lets people opt out. But again, if the standard is that some change you make to the voting structure in your jurisdiction has the effect of running afoul of the VRA, even if it wasn't designed to do so, if it was designed for some other compelling interest that jurisdiction had, there's a problem with that. So the only standard that I want to fight for is that at some point there be some external check on whether or not we need this kind of extraordinary, measure to, fight the pernicious effects of the legacy of discrimination. And I just be much more comfortable if there were some roadmap or some guidepost that would tell us, so what would a sufficiently healed South look like? What would we be able to point to? What are the markers we'd be able to point to recognize that when we see it?
So I don't even think it's necessary. I don't think the Voting Rights Act has anything as ambitious in its conception as a healed South. You know what I mean? That's a matter of men's souls, and I don't think that's an arena where government does particularly well. But I do think that I think for me, particularly after 2012, there's we talk about disparate impact, and sort of in the abstract, it's people, you can imagine a situation where something's not intended, and it just, people aren't trying to be malicious, they're not trying to be racist, right. But it's, after 2012, what from my perspective, I saw a lot of attempts by the Republican Party to alter election rules, not just in the South, but in a lot of places, in ways that would harm Democratic voters who tended to be Black or Hispanic. Now, this is not exact. It's not of the same. It is not the same kind of thing as back in. It's this is not, the motivation there is not white supremacy, right? It's partisanship.
Right.
But nevertheless, it's the kind of thing that it still violates the 15th Amendment, in my view, right? I mean, one of the things that really sort of blew my mind was, there were some places that were trying to outlaw early voting on Sunday because of the knowledge that Sunday is when, the black churches load up buses full of people and take them to the polls.
Yeah.
After church, and you could, it's perfectly easy to be like, well, we're going to outlaw voting on Sunday, and not be like, and it would take an idiot, to really sort of reveal yourself in an explicit way that if you sued in court as opposed to had to clear that with the Justice Department, it would take a real idiot to screw that up. And to make it clear to the entire world that was that was intended to disenfranchise black voters.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it had that effect, and I don't think that it's any. I'm not. From my perspective, that's not past. You know what I mean? That's a temptation, particularly when we're living in a world where, unfortunately, for now, race is sometimes seen as some people as a proxy for party identification. It can be tremendously tempting to alter the rules in ways that abridge people's right to vote on the basis of race.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I mean, this is great. This is a great illustration of why it's so horrible for the United States of America and for democracy that voting is so racially polarized. Because the other side of this is, I've made this case to you before, and I know there's an asymmetry here, and it's not apples to apples, but I don't want to make too big a deal of it, but what you say suggests that there's a flip side to that, which is that there is a coalition of forces that is best served, their interests are best served by the continuing racial polarization of voting, and by having at their disposal a structure of laws that were well conceived and virtuously enacted, to protect minorities from discrimination, that also happen to have the effect of having a higher bar to affecting the franchise in any way of minorities than there would be for white voters. So that redounds to the benefit of the Democratic Party. Now, I don't think there's anything like a widespread conspiracy to use civil rights era voting rights laws to elect permanent Democratic majorities. But every time that you recognize that, since race is a proxy for party affiliation, sad but true, every time you recognize that as part of the motivation for partisan plans to hurt the other guy, you have to acknowledge that there's two sides to that. And I just think that the upshot of all of it is that one of the worst things going on in American democracy right now is that you can really accurately guess who somebody voted for in the presidential election by looking at, their gonads, their skin pigment, and their age,
Well, so I'd say this. Remember that this is not, and I think there is a perception, and I think that's sort of Scalia's sort of id was expressing this, which is that there's this perception that these laws only help people of color. Now, it's the case that, minorities in this country have been historically disenfranchised, but it's not the case. I mean, but the point of the law is not abridging the right of black people to vote on the basis of race. It's abridging the right to vote on the basis of race. And there have been instances, I mean, there have been moments where the Obama administration actually denied preclearance to a guy who was trying to prevent, it was a black guy who was in Mississippi, was trying to prevent white Republicans from crossing over and voting in a Democratic primary. Mm-hmm. And they denied him preclearance because he was very clearly trying to disenfranchise, white voters in the area. Like, the point of these laws is not, and I think this is what's so infuriating about what Scalia said, is like to refer to the Voting Rights Act as a racial entitlement actually ignores the fact that it protects people's right not to have their right to vote abridged on the basis of race, it doesn't just protect black people or Hispanic people, and that's it's sort of it's angering because I think people even when people recognize that this legislation was sort of historically necessary or something like that, they don't recognize how much. They don't recognize that it's something that was done for the country and not just something that was done sort of as a favor or as restitution or as this is merely the fulfillment of the same promise that was made to everyone but was not fulfilled for everyone. I guess is what I would say about that.
Yeah, true. I mean, and so the it puts me in mind of the hoopla over the new Black Panthers and that stuff, and
right, this is actually related. I mean, this is a case that happened during the Bush administration, and one of the guys actually accused the Obama Justice Department of sort of ignoring this case in Mississippi, but in fact they did deny the guy pre-clearance. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's what I was going to say. So obviously you're going to see 99 cases of trying to disenfranchise. Or maybe it's not obvious. Maybe you'll tell me it's not. But you'll see way more cases of disenfranchisement that affect minorities than that affect white Republicans. So I mean your point is absolutely well taken, and I didn't mean to suggest that this is some kind of reparation or restitution or whatever for minorities. But again, I think I guess we should leave it at this pretty soon. But the kernel of truth in what Robert said about the way to stop discriminating on the basis of race, stop discriminating on the basis of race, is exactly what I was getting at, which is that at some point you're going to reach people. Lyndon Johnson knew that and Richard Nixon knew that affirmative action. Policy that Johnson supported came with some downside, and it came with the potential for abuse. We've known this from day one. We've known that when you when you try and repair systematic injustices by writing race into the law more than it already was, you can do a lot of good that way, but it's going to come with some downside. So the question for me, and I think even though it's uncarefully put when Robert said that, because it betrays a kind of thoughtlessness, about the intention and the purpose of the laws that he's casually, casting aside. There's a kernel of truth there, and the question that just has to be established, and it should be thought about every time there's a case like this. And so I think it's to the good that there's debate on it, is at what point does it do more harm than good? It's, constitutional jurisprudence is to a large degree about balancing tests, right? Especially stuff like this.
I mean, it's a fair question. Even the attorney for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund said, he said in court during arguments, he said, look, we won't need this forever, but we still need it now.
Yeah, and that's and I'd be perfectly satisfied if I read opinions, however the case is decided, that reasoned along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't be I don't know that I would be satisfied with the outcome. I would just it would be at least I should say intellectually, there would be more intellectual integrity, to the extent that that's the test that they're applying.
Well, look, Dan, once again, it's wonderful to have you. Thank you for coming on the show. And I think we went a little longer than we expected, but that's because we were having a really good conversation.
Yeah, I hope they don't have to edit it out.
Thanks so much for coming on, and I'll hope to have you on in the future.
Thanks a lot, Adam. Always a pleasure.
All right, take care.